Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Brain Trainer podcast, AI for Social Impact. My name is Elsa from the Brain Trainer team, and in today's episode, we are honored to share our conversation with Lindsey Chartrand, the Indigenous Projects Manager at MILA, Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute. Lynnsey is a trailblazer who's dedicated her career to weaving Indigenous knowledges, talent, and perspectives into the fabric of AI innovation. In this episode, we're diving into a transformative conversation with Lynnsey. We'll explore questions like, what can Indigenous knowledge teach us about creating ethical AI? How can principles like reciprocity reshape how we design and use technology? And most importantly, how do we ensure AI becomes a tool for empowerment, not exclusion? Lynnsey brings incredible insights into how technology and culture intersect, offering a fresh perspective on building a tech landscape that works for everyone. Get ready for a conversation that challenges the status quo and inspires new possibilities. Let's jump right in.
We're very pleased to have our guest today, Lindsey Chartron. And as usual, we'll just get it going. Alex, please kick us off.
So, such a pleasure having you here today, Lindsey. And what we usually like to start off with, because we're interested in how people end up in their role for focusing often on AI for social impact in various ways. You've had a history starting out Indigenous programming and innovation at McGill University, but could you really talk about the journey that landed you to focus on Indigenous AI at MILA?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I have to be clear that this is a journey that even surprised myself. Had you asked me 20 years ago where I would have ended up, I don't think I would have said not necessarily even AI, but even just like the tech sector, more broadly even. So I mean, on a personal note, I think it's worth first noting that my father's family is Red River Métis, and I was born and raised in Treaty 4 territory in the south of Saskatchewan. So this work is, in addition to kind of aligning with my professional trajectory, is also deeply personal. Um, on the professional side, I'm a sociologist by training. I did a lot of my research on education being used as a tool, basically to kind of inculcate Indigenous citizens in the U.S. into predefined roles, right? And so, I did a lot of thinking about education, the power of education, the different ways it can be used as a tool, both to empower but also to disempower marginalized communities. So that's something I thought a lot about in my both my undergraduate and my graduate degree. Uh, Professionally, I did some work in the policy space as well for about 7 years, particularly the innovation space. And that was, I think, where that first spark kind of arose, intrigue around AI. I did some work as, just kind of one of Canada's key priority sectors that kind of caught my interest. I went back to my roots, worked at McGill doing Indigenous outreach and engagement and building up programs. And then I got a tap on the shoulder from Mila with an opportunity that both seemed daunting and exciting, right? This was the first role of its kind, a role that's dedicated really entirely to exploring and helping to define and advocate for this emerging but promising intersection between Indigenous and AI. And I jumped at the opportunity. After some reflection, I thought, opportunities like this don't come up often. I think that there's a real chance here to not just personally make a mark, but to advocate for Indigenous communities and to make space for Indigenous communities within this field that we are told is going to have such high impact on basically every facet of our lives. So that's how I arrived at this point. And I'll say I haven't been disappointed. I've been in this space for about a year now, and it's been a wild ride, but very, very exciting. Lots of really interesting work happening that I'm happy to share with you both today.
I also have an Indigenous background. I'm from South America. Aymaras peoples of Southern Peru. So also I try to make sure that I highlight that and see, what is the value of that perspective. The last time, a previous guest, we had Jada Joel Gomez, who you probably know, who's done the work on abundant intelligence, and spoke there about just trying to see what is the value, or what is the perspective that indigenous brings into this AI shaping. And then we've spoken before with other people, like one that's I always bring her up is Elena Juneso from the Human Feedback Foundation, and I like how she frames AI as something that's like a child that is growing quite fast. What would you say, just from your background, from the work you've been doing at Mila, you think is the perspective that Indigenous brings that should be of interest to the people who maybe don't know that, what is that? Like, why should Indigenous perspectives be included in AI development?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different directions that we could go in here. And of course, I think it's worth noting kind of from the outset that, Indigenous perspectives and knowledges and worldviews are just incredibly diverse. So it's certainly not one thing. No doubt kind of difficult to pin down, almost I'd say even, difficult to wrap your mind around when you're initially thinking of these two things that, at first glance might in some ways seem at odds with one another, but in other ways not. So when I think about this intersection of Indigenous and AI, I like to first start by framing it as what can AI do for Indigenous communities, but likewise, what can Indigenous communities and perspectives bring to the AI space? And I think there's a few different kind of buckets that we could explore here. In terms of what Indigenous, perspectives or worldviews can bring to the AI space, I think, of course, there's kind of like, and this is still very much so in its exploratory phase, but can Indigenous perspectives be built in a technical capacity to AI systems? This is something that is really, really in its early stages of exploration. There are researchers like Dane Malenfant, who is Métis from Saskatchewan as well, like me, who's doing his research at Mila currently and exploring whether AI systems can be taught the concept of reciprocity. So really, really interesting work happening there, but again, very, very early stages. An area that I think is just kind of brimming with opportunity is really thinking about how Indigenous perspectives can influence and help to shape some of the key conversations currently happening in the AI space. So, taking AI safety, for example, or responsible AI. I think far too often there's a tendency to look to Indigenous knowledges as something that's locked in time, or to look to them in retrospect and think, oh, well, maybe Indigenous folks did know something about the environment, about being, proper kind of stewards of the earth. And so, I mean, I think there's a real opportunity, given that AI is very much still an emerging field, to put these two things in conversation with one another now, right? To think about, we had an elder join us this summer as a part of the Pathfinders program, which I no doubt will talk about shortly. But when I asked his opinion on AI, he talked about whether it's coming from the heart, whether there's alignment there. Something so simple, something so human that would almost seem intuitive, to talk about whether something's coming from the heart, and if not, there needs to be better alignment. But we don't make space for this. We don't make space for these kinds of conversations within the AI space, or even just the tech space more broadly. So I think that there's a lot that, AI or Indigenous perspectives can bring to kind of existing and emerging conversations, both kind of like in policy, data governance, again, AI safety. There's just kind of so much to unpack there. And of course, I alone can't speak for all Indigenous communities. But there's a really kind of like rich tapestry of perspectives that could be woven in to these conversations as they evolve.
I wanted to go a little bit deeper on that, because we've had the pleasure of hosting you as one of the speakers when we looked at connecting the importance of digital equity and the digital divide, and really looking at how important that is when tying it to emerging technologies like AI that will permeate all of our systems and turn a divide into a chasm. On one side, we have lots of challenges at closing that gap. But on the other side, if we do close it, and leaning into Carolyn Hilton's Indigenomics and what the opportunity is if we do have an inclusive digital society leaning into AI, wondering if you can speak a little bit about the connection between digital equity, the digital divide, and what are opportunities through, for instance, the Pathfinder program and others like it that bring inclusion into the AI space.
Yeah. So I think it's really important that we balance these kind of forward-looking conversations with current realities. So, we really are quick to get wrapped up in like AI literacy while ignoring kind of basic day-to-day realities that, Indigenous students in remote communities might not have access to a science teacher throughout years of their high school education. So I think of, making sure that we don't lose sight of that as we're trying to address these gaps. And I'd love to talk about these gaps kind of in terms of what we did this summer with Pathfinders. But I think it's first important to address that and make sure that our thinking around kind of, again, these more future focused conversations and, inclusion within the AI space are coupled with recognizing current systemic realities for Indigenous people in terms of barriers to access to education, like you said, digital infrastructure, financial barriers allowing or restricting, their participation in this space in very real ways on the day-to-day. So I think that's first and foremost. There are, again, so many opportunities here. And I think primarily because the AI space brings something new, and that's that it's still very much emerging. So often in many of these sectors where Indigenous representation or underrepresentation is an issue, we're left to play catch up. After years and years of kind of, gaps in terms of their inclusion in various spaces, whether that, be STEM or other kind of areas of the workforce where underrepresentation is an issue, we have a real opportunity here to do something different from the ground up. No doubt kind of, digital infrastructure, et cetera, have to accompany that. But I think just as a space, as an ecosystem, it's really important that we recognize and seize this opportunity that's really unique in a lot of ways.
So I just participated last weekend at a hackathon organized by Meta, and then team up with a group of 3 other student developers to create an AI-powered platform. And it's a super learning experience, but also made me realize just how accessible actually AI is right now to people who just have ideas and who can just come up with the ways in which we can actually harness the opportunity that AI brings. So you run this Indigenous Pathfinders on AI program. I'd like you to please maybe just explain it to the audience what it is. And also you run a first cohort, I think August, right? You had 11 participants. I'm just reading the website. And there's prototype building, and what if you can just talk about like what were the aha moments, what were the things that were great or highlights from that cohort that you can speak about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just first understanding some of the context around why we developed the Pathfinders program to begin with is maybe important to set the stage. So, I mean, Indigenous folks in Canada comprise roughly about 5% of the population, but only about 1% of the digital workforce, with that number no doubt being lower within the AI space. We worked with Inspire, which is really an organization that's a leader in supporting Indigenous education here in Canada, So Mila, this, AI Research Institute coming together with this well-established organization that's been supporting educational pathways for Indigenous talent for years and years, putting kind of, our two minds together, so to speak, was really where the idea for the Pathfinders program was birthed. And part of this was because of a stark realization on the part of Inspire, where within their database a few years ago, there was something like, 4 Indigenous students enrolled in computer science degrees. Like, we're talking 4 nationally, and they have, if I'm not mistaken, the largest network of Indigenous students in the country. So that was a reality, I think, that was quite jarring and created a great sense of urgency. So again, we put our two kind of organizations together around the table to think about what we could do and what kind of experience would be most beneficial to Indigenous students. And we came up with the Indigenous Pathfinders in AI program, which is really a career pathway program geared towards empowering Indigenous students to learn, develop, and eventually to lead within the AI space. So we brought, as you said, 11 talented and brave souls to Montreal for the summer over the course of 2.5 months, so starting at the end of May. And during this time, they explored the foundations of machine learning. So there was a strong technical component. Also, a lot of non-technical subject matter covered as well. So I mentioned things like AI safety, fairness, data sovereignty. There was also a strong cultural component. So we brought in elders and knowledge keepers to contribute to the conversation. We really emphasized a teaching each other approach, a lot of reciprocal learning, really tried to reduce conventional top-down hierarchies in the classroom and made it conversational in a lot of ways. We also provided space to really explore that intersection of Indigenous and AI. So you mentioned the Abundant Intelligences project. We brought them in to do a session with the students to really kind of explore what Indigenous futures will look like. So it was really a rich and diverse experience. The students also undertook projects over the course of the summer, which were really geared towards identifying AI solutions for the benefit of Indigenous communities. So these projects were all collaborative in nature. We had just really impressive projects come out of these collaborative efforts. And also not just, it's worth also mentioning that not just identifying, AI solutions to benefit Indigenous communities, but also really thinking about these projects in a more holistic way. So what their community engagement plan would be, what their plan for sustainability would be, what kind of metrics would measure success, identifying potential funding partners. So it was really a hands-on way of them applying the skills that they were learning in the classroom throughout the experience. And we're actually, as the program kind of matures, and currently we're piloting what we're calling the Indigenous AI Impact Residency at Mila, where we're supporting one of the projects, the SAGE project, coming out of the Pathfinders program, to continue to advance the AI solution that they came up with. So it was a bit experimental, but I would say a really enriching opportunity for all who were involved. In terms of kind of like what surprised me, lots of surprises. I would say one of my favorite moments was really bringing in people from communities. So again, knowledge keepers, elders, storytellers, who were able to sit in this AI space and kind of for the first time think about, how do Indigenous knowledges intersect with the AI space? And so it was kind of those ripple effects, those unintended ripple effects that I think were really, really rewarding, in addition to, of course, watching the students grow over the course of the experience, that were really special. I'll also maybe just add that the program has talking about ripple effects, the program also has a strong emphasis on ambassadorship. So recognizing that, the Pathfinders program is really targeting students primarily at the university level, that's actually quite late in the educational journey. And we need to get or foster an interest in AI much, much earlier than that. And so now, that we're building up this alumni network from the Pathfinders program, we're hoping that we can provide platforms for them to share their stories with Indigenous youth. So last year, for example, we attended a big event that Inspire holds for Indigenous high school students across the country. So attending events like that to really share their story and create a spark to really place AI on the map for Indigenous youth who are exploring potential career educational pathways.
Is that you would say the learning in terms of, because the first cohort ended and now there's a new cohort that's going to start in the summer next year? Aside from that, is there anything else that you are looking to that you learned from running this first cohort that you're looking to incorporate into the next one?
Yeah, good question. Lots of learnings, lots of opportunity. I think the biggest challenge right now is trying to figure out what direction to go in first. We are currently, to my knowledge, the only kind of career pathway program like this designed exclusively for Indigenous talent. And so there's just tremendous opportunity. And so it's trying to figure out, okay, well, do we look at kind of, developing a second stream that's maybe more advanced technically? Do we look at trying to find internships? How can we make the projects, bring them from kind of like in the classroom still to the real world? How do we create that impact for Indigenous communities? How do we get others involved? Like, we're again kind of bringing in a really small portion of the population, but how do we share that outward? How do we share that knowledge? How do we share that experience outward? So I think to some degree, we're doing a lot of mapping in that regard. What next? Who are some key partners who would love to be involved with this, and particularly at the community level? So I think in a lot of ways, we're still learning, we're still mapping, we're still figuring out how we can have the Pathfinders program really serve as a foundational, but like a building block, and to build out from here.
I want to tie in a few different aspects that we've talked about now, because first of all, the work that you're doing and the approach that you're taking to have not only youth but communities seeing themselves in AI, even if they don't have technical expertise in AI, is so important. And we had the meeting yesterday with ecosystem and players in the Indigenous ecosystem, and Connected North, that does a lot of work with youth around role modeling and awareness and how important that is. And just relating it, the baffling and staggering number of 4 Indigenous students in computer science. We see the similar things in architecture, for instance, which then translates to, if we're like, I work in affordable housing and wearing a different hat, if you do not have people with lived experience that sit on a technical expertise, you will not be able to, for instance, build supply for affordable housing that connects with community. And similar here when we're exploring emerging technologies like AI, if we do not have people with lived experience, it's so crucial to really closing those gaps. So, and then tying it to internationally, the digital divide number is 65%. Like it's staggering in how many people and communities and countries are not connected to digital society. So leading into what are the opportunities for Canada, but really leading into Indigenous ecosystems in Canada to lead internationally, leaning into data sovereignty, Indigenous knowledge systems and AI, especially when organizations like Abundant Intelligences are already structured in pods, Maori in New Zealand, Hawaiian Indigenous, Lakota in the US, and here to really be an example of what leaning into Indigenous knowledge, data sovereignty, and not only being beneficial for Indigenous communities, but being beneficial for pushing AI in directions that are beneficial for society overall?
Yeah, I mean, I love, data sovereignty is just like we could have a whole podcast about that. And there's really great people doing work in this area that are far more equipped than I am to speak about it. And just maybe, for the sake of kind of defining data sovereignty, we're really talking about the right of Indigenous people to own, control, access, and govern their own data. And we've seen in recent years, efforts like the OCAP principles have really been supporting what's called the data back movement. And as I'm thinking about data sovereignty, and I shared this story with you yesterday, Alex, in the meeting that you referred to. But I had a friend recently say to me, who's also working in the tech sector, well, what's special about Indigenous data? And my knee-jerk reaction was to feel offended by his question. But it actually forced me to a place to say, well, what is special about Indigenous data? Maybe everyone should be a little bit more concerned about this. And maybe conversations around Indigenous data sovereignty are actually several steps ahead of where everyone else is. And that, again, there's like a real opportunity for Indigenous people to lead this conversation. And I think it's important to say also that in these situations, data is also not neutral, right? So data sets are embedded with stories, with power dynamics, with systems of oppression, and while the autonomous digitization, if you will, of Indigenous data is important for preserving culture, there's a lot of promise there. For transmitting, revitalizing heritage. There's really, we have the FLAIR project at NELO, which is the First Languages AI reality project led by Michael Runningwolf. I mean, there's tremendous opportunity here, but, Indigenous people, and particularly younger generations, have often been excluded from these processes. So where I think there's actually real opportunity to lead. And so we really need to look at a more kind of ethical, like as an AI ecosystem, a more ethical approach to AI and to data governance. Of course, in light of our conversation here today, with regard to Indigenous context specifically. And also, I think it's really worth noting that historically, Indigenous communities have long served as the stewards of their own data and their knowledge, even if it wasn't called data in the modern sense. So, you take wampum belts, for example, which were used to record histories and alliances and political relations, effectively functioning as record keeping long before contemporary conversations around data governance. And these approaches were really kind of deeply interactive and collective and preserved through community memory and traditions. And on that note, I'd also just say, thinking about how Indigenous kind of perspectives or approaches to privacy and data stewardship can influence today's conversation. I think it's also important to acknowledge that with regard to individual privacy concerns versus collective privacy concerns, there's also some really kind of rich insight that Indigenous communities can bring here. So whether that's kind of related to harms or benefits or control of data within Indigenous contexts, I think that these factors can't be fully addressed through individually focused consent mechanisms, and that we need to explore collective governance approaches as well for managing data in terms of how it's used and shared within AI contexts.
I think just as a brief comment, there is data sovereignty does not mean not sharing of data. And that people believe that data sovereignty means that everybody's holding their own. No, that doesn't. That means that you control the level of access and that you have the ability to redact or so forth. And just a reflection again, leaning back to where I believe Canada, but Indigenous Canada, can lead. The history that you just spoke to, the rationale for data sovereignty, why it's important, is strong here in Canada. So that the relationship, for instance, working with big tech has those healthy boundaries. Whereas when we work with digital equity or data sovereignty in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, there isn't that hesitancy and hesitates to say lack of understanding, because I think it's just that history hasn't gone through the same path. So it would be easier for big tech to then step in and say, we're doing great things with your data, just hand it over. So I think that learning and that sharing of the rationale would be great.
Absolutely. And I love that you kind of made clear that it's not about hoarding, but also, I mean, thinking about, right, of course, like ownership and control, informed consent and protocols, cultural sensitivity, but also thinking about benefits to community. So that data should be used to primarily serve community interests and the interests of Indigenous people, contributing to self-determination, capacity building, community development. And so any kind of external parties who have access to that data need to be sure that it aligns with Indigenous kind of aspirations and priorities. So I think that's also a really key point.
Just a quick reflection that because I said I'm from Peru, and in Peru, 80% of the Peru's populations identify themselves as either indigenous or Métis, or mestizo, but it's just the word for Métis. In Canada, the contrast is just, as we said, 5%. But that 5%, as we very well know, has different challenges. There's a high percentage of homelessness, gaps in education. I think the opportunity here is that we may have in the technology a way to empower them and actually help themselves and help the community, because that 5% is has been disregarded for quite a while, and we have an opportunity to empower them to have something that they can use to help themselves, help the community, and as a result help the country. Anyways, my question was, from the work that you've done at Mila and the running that first cohort, have you started to see, whether it be within the lens of Mila or within your work, because you mentioned you've done other work with abundant intelligence, so you have this ecosystem already being built. Have you started to see some examples of progress or examples where, like, for example, data sovereignty or other things are starting to, make a difference or being highlighted or show up as outcomes?
Well, I mean, short answer is I think it's maybe too soon, right? So we've had the Pathfinders program, while absolutely a great step forward, this is still a new initiative. So I think it's important to be humble about the maybe impact it's had to date. I also think that there's a level of, us being real with ourselves about how quickly the AI space is moving, who's currently at the leadership table, acknowledging also that it's a really profit-driven sector, and the likelihood of, again, keeping in mind existing already kind of baseline barriers that Indigenous populations in Canada face with regard to, again, finances, education, healthcare, basic day-to-day survival things. Coupling that with like the current gap, not just in AI, but, I
I love what you just said in terms of radical or radically collaborative, and I think that's something that we try to emphasize not only for indigenous ecosystems that you're talking about, but for nonprofit social impact and philanthropy, because of the scarcity of resources, because we can't afford not to collaborate. But I want to switch gears as we're probably have a couple of 2 or 3 questions left. To understanding what can communities do, what can philanthropy, cross-sector collaboration as allies and supporters do to support the ecosystem development that you and your partners have started catalyzing? Well, what are some avenues aside from purely funding, or how can we support being radically collaborative?
And I love everything you said. I love everything that you put together about the need of radical collaboration. Don't be surprised. So often we do is like people say these wonderful ways of putting things. We do presentations talking about ecosystem building. You just find yourself in our slides because you just said it so well. And yeah, about creating solutions. Brain Trainer is actually working on a platform that will not be the silver bullet, but be hopefully support to the ecosystem building education learning platform, and also look into partnering right now with 2 indigenous organizations just to make sure that we also, we're not doing things alone in silo, but we are amplify the work that we're doing. So as we're closing the podcast now, we're coming to the end. I'd like to ask something that I ask all the guests. What is it that you may be looking forward to, whether it be the next year or in the years to come when it comes to the work you're doing? Is there any like future outcome that you're looking to accomplish in the next couple of years? And also added to that, also if there's anything else that you think you would like to share with the audience who are like people within the social impact space, philanthropists, nonprofits, leaders, etc., that you would like to also impart on them as a closing reflection as well.
Yeah, just as a couple of closing reflections, as Norman stated, we often find ourselves with like golden nuggets or important insights, and there's so many here. I just want to close on saying or reflecting on a couple of things that you said, that we need to have humility and really think about unlearning some of the systems that have been shaping our thinking, especially with emerging technologies. And that's not a flaw, that's a strength to unlearn, because our issue isn't about the technology, it's the culture and mindsets that are shaping technology. So really, really appreciate your time.
Yes, thank you. We will share the links to the cohorts that you're looking to launch and anything else. But yeah, I wanted to once again, you're the second Mila member that we had, and we're gonna looking to have more people from Mila because you're doing very great work. Actually, your applied projects, I always talk about them, and I highlight just how much of an example that is of what we could be doing when we're talking about harnessing the potential that the AI can have to really have great impact. So good work on what you're doing and Mila's doing, and yeah, thanking everybody that's listened, and yeah, until next time.